There is a strange passage hidden in the letter to the Hebrews. It speaks of men of faith who were persecuted, tortured, killed by the sword, and some who were even sawn in two. The writer never tells us who that man was. But one of the oldest traditions preserved by Jewish and Christian writers says it was Isaiah, the prophet who saw the throne of God, the prophet who described the suffering of the Messiah centuries before Jesus was born. And according to that ancient tradition, this same man eventually fled from a king who wanted him silenced and hid inside the hollow trunk of a tree. How did the man who once stood before God's throne end his life, trapped inside a tree, with a saw coming toward him? That is the story we are about to uncover. Before Isaiah became the prophet whose words would echo through thousands of years of history, he was simply a man living in Jerusalem. He had a family. He had a home. He knew the streets of the city, the rhythms of its people, and the uncertainty that could settle over a nation when its future suddenly became unclear. The moment that changed everything came in the year King Uzziah died. Uzziah had ruled Judah for 52 years, for an entire generation. His reign had been part of the landscape of everyday life, but now the king was gone, and the stability people had taken for granted was beginning to disappear. Beyond Judah's borders, another power was rising. Assyria was becoming one of the most feared empires of the ancient Near East. Its armies were expanding, its kings were demanding submission, and smaller nations understood what happened to those who stood in their way. Jerusalem was not yet under attack, but the danger was coming, and Isaiah was living through that uncertainty when he entered the temple. We often imagine biblical prophets as distant figures, men who seem to have been born knowing exactly what they were supposed to do. But Isaiah's story does not begin that way. He was not standing in the temple with a complete understanding of his future. He did not know which kings he would confront. He did not know how many times his warnings would be rejected. He did not know that one day his name would be associated with some of the most important prophecies about the Messiah. And he certainly did not know that an ancient tradition would one day remember him as a man hunted to his death. At this point, Isaiah was simply standing at the threshold of something he could not yet understand. Perhaps he had come seeking answers about his nation. Perhaps he was mourning the death of the king. Perhaps he was simply doing what he had done many times before, entering the place where Judah believed it could draw near to God. Whatever brought him there, he was about to discover that God was not going to give him the kind of answer he expected. Instead, Isaiah was about to see something that would completely redefine his understanding of himself. And when that vision came, the first thing he would learn was not that he was chosen, it was that he was unworthy. Because before God would send Isaiah to speak to kings, nations, and generations yet unborn, he would first have to show Isaiah the king. The temple did not become brighter, it became larger. The walls seemed to disappear as Isaiah looked upward, and suddenly the ordinary world he knew was gone. Above him was a throne, high and exalted, and seated upon it was the Lord. The train of his robe filled the temple. Around the throne stood seraphim, each with 6 wings. 2 covered their faces, 2 covered their feet. With the remaining 2, they flew through the presence of God, and then they spoke. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Their voices shook the foundations of the temple. Smoke filled the room. And Isaiah did something that might surprise us. He did not celebrate. He did not immediately feel honored that God had chosen him. He broke down, "Woe is me, for I am lost." Why would a vision of God's glory make a prophet feel this way? Because for the first time, Isaiah saw himself in the right light. Standing before the holiness of God, all the things that might have made him feel respectable disappeared. His position, his knowledge, his religious devotion, none of it could hide the condition of his heart. "I am a man of unclean lips," he said, "and I dwell among a people of unclean lips." This was not the confession of a criminal hiding from justice. It was the reaction of a man who suddenly understood the enormous distance between human weakness and divine holiness. Isaiah believed he was finished. He had seen the king. And yet, instead of destruction, something unexpected happened. One of the seraphim flew toward the altar and took a burning coal from the fire with tongs. Then he brought it to Isaiah. The coal touched his lips. and the seraph announced that his guilt had been taken away and his sin atoned for. Only after Isaiah had been broken, confronted and purified did he hear the voice of God. "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" This was the moment, not a command forced upon him, not a promise of comfort. An invitation. Isaiah could have asked what would happen to him. He could have asked whether the people would listen. He could have asked how difficult the mission would become. Instead, his answer was immediate. "Here I am. Send me." Those 3 words would shape the next decades of his life. But there is something we should notice. God did not tell Isaiah that his mission would be successful in the way we usually define success. In fact, Isaiah was warned that many people would hear his words without understanding them. They would see without perceiving. His message would be rejected by the very people he was being sent to reach. Isaiah said yes anyway. He was saying yes before he knew about the kings, yes before he knew about the rejection, yes before he knew about the suffering, and, according to the ancient tradition surrounding the end of his life, yes before he knew that faithfulness would eventually cost him everything. The man who entered the temple looking for answers had walked in as one person. He walked out carrying a calling, and from that day forward, Isaiah would spend the rest of his life trying to make one truth heard in a nation that increasingly did not want to hear it. He had seen the glory of God once. Now he would have to carry that memory into a world that often seemed determined to forget him. Isaiah's calling did not take him away from ordinary life. He remained a husband and a father, and even his family became part of the message God had given him. His sons were given names that carried prophetic meaning, reminders of judgment and hope. His warnings were not theories written on a scroll somewhere far from Jerusalem. They followed him home. His children carried them in their names. His neighbors heard them in the streets. And the kings of Judah learned that Isaiah was not afraid to speak where other men remained silent. Judah had a religious problem, but Isaiah saw that it was becoming something much deeper. People were still going to the temple. They still knew the language of worship. But outside the temple, the weak were being crushed. Idolatry was spreading. Altars to foreign gods were appearing across the land. Leaders who were supposed to defend justice could be corrupted. The powerful took advantage of widows, orphans, and the poor. Isaiah refused to treat these things as separate problems. To him, a nation could not claim to honor God while deliberately hurting the people God commanded it to protect. So he walked into the streets of Jerusalem and spoke. His words were not gentle. He called Judah a sinful nation. He described its spiritual condition like a wounded body covered with injuries that no one was willing to treat. Even when Isaiah spoke about judgment, there was always an invitation underneath it. Come back, listen, turn around before it is too late. That message made him difficult to ignore and even harder to love, because people can tolerate a prophet who predicts something far away. They become uncomfortable when he looks directly at what they are doing today. Isaiah did exactly that, and sometimes God asked him to make the message visible through his own life. In one striking prophetic act, Isaiah was instructed to go barefoot and without his outer garment for 3 years as a sign of the humiliation that would come upon nations trusting in political alliances and military power instead of God. Imagine the cost of that. Imagine being recognized in the streets of Jerusalem as the man whose very appearance had become a warning. He could not preach and then disappear. His life itself had become part of the sermon. And yet the hardest part of his calling was not that people disliked him. It was that God had already told him many would hear his words and refuse to understand them. Isaiah was being sent to people who, in many cases, would choose not to listen. The prophet had to keep going without the reassurance of immediate results. Year after year, king after king, warning after warning, he would watch people reject the message, only to return the next day and speak again. And somewhere in those decades of rejection, Isaiah's mission became more than a prophetic assignment. It became a choice he had to make again and again. Would he keep speaking when no one applauded? Would he keep warning when people called him a fanatic? Would he keep telling the truth when silence would make his own life easier? Isaiah did not know where that road would end, but he kept walking. And as the years passed, the message God gave him began to reach far beyond the immediate crisis in Judah. Isaiah was about to speak about something no king in Jerusalem could control, a future king, a suffering servant, and a redemption that would come long after Isaiah himself was gone. The longer Isaiah spoke, the more his message seemed to reach beyond the world around him. He was warning Judah about kings and armies, about idolatry and judgment, but woven through those warnings was something much larger, a vision of what God would eventually do when human power had failed. Isaiah spoke of a child who would be born, a son who would be given, and a ruler whose kingdom would carry names far greater than those of any king sitting on the throne of Jerusalem. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. These were not the titles of an ordinary political leader. Isaiah was looking toward a future he would never see with his own eyes. He also spoke of a mysterious sign, a child who would be called Emmanuel, God with us. For a people living under the shadow of foreign empires, that promise carried a meaning that went far beyond politics. God had not abandoned his people. But Isaiah's vision did not stop with a promised child. He saw another image, a tree that had been cut down. The royal line of David could appear finished, like a great tree reduced to a lifeless stump. Yet Isaiah said that from that stump a shoot would emerge. Life would come from what looked dead. A ruler would arise from the line of Jesse, David's father, and the Spirit of the Lord would rest upon him. He would not rule merely through military strength. He would judge with righteousness. He would defend the poor. And Isaiah imagined a world so completely restored that even the relationship between predator and prey would be transformed. The wolf would dwell with the lamb. The leopard would lie down with the young goat. The earth itself would be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. But then Isaiah saw something even more difficult to understand. The promised servant would suffer. He would be despised and rejected. A man acquainted with grief, someone people would turn away from rather than follow. And then came the words that would become some of the most important lines in the entire book. He would be wounded because of the transgressions of others. He would be crushed because of their iniquities. He would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and yet he would remain silent before his accusers. Imagine Isaiah receiving that revelation. He was living in a world where people expected salvation to look like victory, a powerful king, a stronger army, enemies defeated, Jerusalem restored. But the picture Isaiah was given was different. The one who would bring redemption would first suffer. The one who would carry the sins of others would be rejected by the very people who needed him. And Isaiah was not writing this after the events had happened. He was looking forward. Centuries would pass before Christians would connect these words directly to Jesus of Nazareth. But Isaiah had no gospel account in front of him. He had no cross to look back upon. He had only the revelation he had been given and the responsibility to speak it. That may be one of the most human aspects of his story. He was announcing something he would never personally witness. He would never stand outside Jerusalem and watch Jesus enter the city. He would never see the cross. He would never hear the resurrection proclaimed. He would never know exactly how every line would unfold. He simply had to trust that the God who had spoken to him in the temple was telling the truth. And while Isaiah's eyes were looking centuries into the future, his feet were still standing in a very dangerous present. Judah was surrounded by political threats. Kings were making decisions that could determine the survival of the nation. And soon, Isaiah would discover what his words could mean when an entire army stood outside Jerusalem. For the first time, the prophet who had spent years warning about judgment would become the man a frightened king desperately needed to hear. His name was Hezekiah, and unlike many of the rulers Isaiah had confronted, he actually listened. Hezekiah inherited a kingdom that had already begun to drift away from God. But unlike the kings before him, he decided to turn back. He removed idols, he tore down pagan altars, he restored worship in the temple, and tried to lead Judah back toward the God Isaiah had spent his life proclaiming. For Isaiah, this must have felt like a glimpse of the future he had hoped for. After years of warning, there was finally a king who listened. But then the Assyrians came. Their army had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Now Jerusalem stood in their path. The city was surrounded by an enemy that seemed almost impossible to defeat, and the Assyrians understood that fear could be more powerful than weapons. Their representatives stood outside Jerusalem and mocked the people behind the walls. They reminded them of all the nations Assyria had already conquered. Then they asked a terrifying question. What makes you think your God will be any different? Inside Jerusalem, the people could hear the enemy's words. Imagine what that must have felt like. You are behind the walls of your city. You know the army outside has already destroyed kingdoms. You know that if the walls fall, there may be nowhere to run. And now the enemy is telling you that your faith is useless. Hezekiah was shaken. He tore his clothes and went into the temple. Then he sent messengers to Isaiah. The prophet who had spent decades warning Judah about judgment was suddenly being asked for an answer that could determine whether Jerusalem survived. Isaiah's response was not panic, it was a promise. Do not be afraid. The king of Assyria would not enter Jerusalem. He would not shoot an arrow into the city. And according to the biblical account, the threat ended in a way Judah could never have achieved through its own military strength. The army of Assyria was struck down, and its king withdrew. Jerusalem survived. For Isaiah, this was more than a political victory. It was a reminder that the God he had seen in the temple was still present when the walls of Jerusalem seemed helpless. But there was another moment when Isaiah's relationship with Hezekiah became deeply personal. The king became seriously ill. Isaiah came to him with devastating news. You shall die, you shall not recover. Imagine hearing those words from the man you trusted to speak for God. Hezekiah turned toward the wall and prayed. And before Isaiah had even left the palace grounds, another message came. God had heard the king's prayer. Hezekiah would receive 15 additional years of life. The prophet who had just announced death was now announcing mercy. Isaiah's life was never as simple as being a prophet of doom. He warned, he confronted, he announced judgment, but he also carried hope when people were terrified and mercy when they believed the end had come. And perhaps that is why what happened next was so painful. Because when Hezekiah finally died, the throne passed to his son. His name was Manasseh. He was only 12 years old. And the man who came to power would begin undoing much of what his father had spent his reign rebuilding. For Isaiah, the darkness was returning. And this time, it would be far more personal. If you're enjoying seeing these biblical stories brought to life in this way, consider subscribing. There are many stories like Isaiah's that we've heard before, but rarely experienced like this. And if this story has surprised you so far, leave a like. It helps us bring more stories like this to the channel. The change in Jerusalem did not happen all at once. It happened slowly. The king Isaiah had watched grow from a child began pulling down what his father had built. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king of Judah. He inherited a kingdom that had experienced reform, protection, and renewed worship under Hezekiah. But Manasseh chose a different path. The altars his father had destroyed were rebuilt. Idolatrous practices returned. Pagan worship entered places that had been dedicated to the God of Israel. The temple itself, the very place where Isaiah had once seen the glory of God, was associated with practices the prophet had spent his life condemning. And the corruption was not only religious. The biblical account describes Manasseh's reign as a time of extraordinary evil and violence. He practiced forms of divination and sorcery, and in one of the darkest details recorded about his reign, caused his own son to pass through the fire. Jerusalem became filled with blood. For Isaiah, this was not simply another political change. This was personal. He had known the city before this. He had stood inside its temple. He had walked its streets. He had watched Hezekiah tear down the idols and restore worship. He had watched Jerusalem survive the Assyrian threat. And now, in his old age, he was watching much of it being undone. Think about what that would feel like. Imagine spending an entire lifetime warning a nation about the consequences of turning away from God, and then living long enough to watch the nation make those choices anyway. Isaiah could have stepped back. He was old. He had already served through several kings. He had already delivered more warnings than most people could have imagined hearing in one lifetime. Perhaps he could have told himself that his work was finished, but Isaiah's calling had never been about protecting his own comfort. So the old prophet continued to speak, and that may have made him more dangerous to Manasseh than any army outside Jerusalem. A military enemy could be fought. A prophet could not be defeated so easily, because Isaiah was not trying to take the throne. He was not gathering soldiers. He was not trying to become king. He was doing something much more threatening. He was telling the truth to the man who held the throne. According to the ancient tradition surrounding Isaiah's final years, the prophet confronted Manasseh over the idolatry, violence, and corruption spreading through Judah. The tradition does not give us a transcript of that confrontation. We do not know exactly what Isaiah said, but we know the larger world in which it was remembered. Manasseh was a king who had filled Jerusalem with practices Isaiah believed were an offense against God. And Isaiah was an old prophet who had spent decades warning that such rebellion would not remain without consequences. At some point, according to that tradition, speaking the truth became a crime in the eyes of the king. The man who had once been welcomed by a faithful king was now a threat to a king who wanted no one challenging his authority. And this is where Isaiah's story begins moving toward its darkest chapter. Because the question was no longer whether the people would listen. The question was whether Isaiah would survive long enough to speak again. The king had the power. Isaiah had only his voice. And soon even that voice would be hunted. But before we follow the prophet into hiding, we need to be careful about what we actually know. The books of Kings and Chronicles describe Manasseh's terrible reign. They speak of his idolatry, his violence, and the innocent blood that filled Jerusalem. But they do not give us a detailed account of Isaiah's death. That part comes from an older tradition. Jewish sources preserved the memory of Isaiah being persecuted, and early Christian writers also referred to his death. Later generations connected that tradition with a mysterious line in Hebrews, where the writer speaks of faithful people who were killed in terrible ways, including being sawn in two. The passage does not name Isaiah, but the connection was already ancient. And if we are going to tell this story, that distinction matters. The Bible tells us about Manasseh's bloodshed. The ancient tradition tells us what happened to Isaiah. Those are not the same kind of evidence. According to that tradition, Manasseh eventually ordered Isaiah's arrest. Think about the man being hunted. He was not a young prophet beginning his ministry. He was an old man. He had already served through the reigns of several kings. He had seen Jerusalem threatened by Assyria. He had stood beside Hezekiah during moments of fear and hope. He had spoken about the coming Messiah long before anyone could understand how those promises would be fulfilled. And now, after a lifetime of speaking, he was being hunted because he refused to stop. There is something almost cruel about that contrast. The king had soldiers. Isaiah had no army. The king had a palace. Isaiah had a message. The king could command men to obey him. But Isaiah believed his words came from a higher throne. So according to the tradition, Isaiah fled Jerusalem. He was no longer walking openly through the streets as the prophet who had confronted kings. Now he was trying to escape them. Imagine the landscape around him, the hills of Judah, the dry paths outside the city, the sound of soldiers searching behind him, and an old man who had spent his entire life telling other people not to be afraid was now running for his own life. That does not make him a coward. It makes him human. Faithfulness does not mean that fear disappears. It means fear does not get the final word. And Isaiah was about to discover how far that faithfulness would carry him. The man who had once stood in the temple before the throne of God was now searching for a place where another throne could not reach him. The soldiers were getting closer. The paths were narrowing. There would soon be nowhere left to go. And then Isaiah found something that looked like a way out, a hollow tree. For a moment, the old prophet disappeared from sight. The soldiers passed. The noise faded. Perhaps Isaiah thought he had escaped, but the tradition says they found him. And what happened next would become one of the most disturbing stories preserved about an Old Testament prophet. The man who had spent his life speaking to kings was about to be confronted by the final consequence of refusing to remain silent. The story was moving toward the moment described, centuries later, in that mysterious line about a believer being sawn in two. The soldiers found Isaiah. According to the ancient tradition, the old prophet had taken refuge inside the hollow trunk of a tree, hoping that the soldiers searching for him would pass without discovering where he was hiding. But they found him. And now, there was nowhere left to run. Try to imagine that moment without turning it into a legend. Isaiah was an old man. His body had carried him through decades of ministry. His eyes had witnessed kings rise and fall. His feet had walked the streets of Jerusalem when the city was still secure. His voice had warned generations of people who often refused to listen. Now he was surrounded by men carrying out the command of a king. There was no army coming to rescue him, no palace waiting to protect him, no earthly authority greater than the one that had ordered his death. Only the God Isaiah had trusted since the day he stood before the throne. The ancient tradition says the soldiers began sawing through the tree. The image is difficult to contemplate. The same wood that had briefly hidden Isaiah was now becoming part of his execution. And somewhere inside that tree was the man who had spent his entire life speaking about another kind of king. A king no earthly ruler could threaten, a king whose kingdom would not depend on armies or walls. A king Isaiah had described centuries before anyone knew his name. We should pause here again, because this is where historical honesty matters most. The Bible does not give us Isaiah's final words. It does not tell us exactly what he felt. It does not describe the execution. So we should not invent a speech for him or pretend that we know what happened inside that tree. What we have is the ancient tradition. And that tradition remembers Isaiah as a man who was killed because he refused to abandon the message he had been given. That is enough to make the story powerful, without adding words Scripture never records, because Isaiah's entire life had already answered the question that his death would eventually raise. Would he remain faithful when obedience was no longer comfortable? He had answered it when he stood before the throne. He had answered it when he confronted corruption in Jerusalem. He had answered it when he warned kings. And according to the ancient tradition, he answered it one final time when silence could have saved his life. The man who had once said, "Here I am, send me," had reached the end of that journey. And perhaps the most striking part is what happened after. The soldiers could destroy his body. Manasseh could remove the prophet from Jerusalem, but neither the king nor his soldiers could control what would happen to Isaiah's words. They could not erase the prophecies. They could not undo what he had written. They could not prevent future generations from reading his testimony, and they could not stop those words from reaching a world Isaiah would never live to see. The saw could silence the man, but it could not silence the message. And that is where Isaiah's story takes an unexpected turn, because the prophet who died before the Messiah appeared would eventually become one of the voices through which the world would recognize him. His life was ending. His message was just beginning to travel. Isaiah was gone, but the story of the man who ordered his death was not finished. Manasseh, the king remembered for idolatry and violence, would eventually be captured by the Assyrians and taken away in chains. And there, in humiliation, he finally did something he had spent years avoiding. He prayed. He humbled himself before God. According to 2 Chronicles, God heard his prayer and restored him to Jerusalem. Afterward, Manasseh attempted to remove some of the foreign gods and practices he had introduced, but it does not erase what came before. The violence had happened. The years of corruption had happened, and whatever we make of the ancient tradition about Isaiah, the biblical account is clear that Manasseh's reign left a terrible mark on Judah. Then came another generation. Josiah, Manasseh's grandson, became king while still young. And once again, Judah experienced reform. The temple was restored. The book of the law was rediscovered. Idolatrous practices were confronted. For a moment, it seemed as though the nation might finally return to the path Isaiah had spent his life pointing toward. But the story of Judah was already moving toward judgment. Decades later, the Babylonian army came. Jerusalem was surrounded. The walls fell. The temple was burned, and the people were carried away into exile. Isaiah had warned that judgment would come. Now the city he had loved was experiencing the consequences of generations of rebellion. But there was another part of Isaiah's message that history had not yet reached. Hope. He had spoken not only about destruction, but about restoration. Not only about a fallen kingdom, but about a future king. Not only about suffering, but about redemption. And his words survived the destruction of Jerusalem. They survived the exile. They survived the death of the kings he had known. Centuries passed. Then, On a road between Jerusalem and Gaza, an Ethiopian official was reading the book of Isaiah. He had opened the scroll to a passage describing a servant led like a sheep to the slaughter. He did not understand who Isaiah was talking about. Then Philip approached him, and beginning with that very passage, Philip told him about Jesus. The words Isaiah had written centuries earlier were now being read as part of the story of Christ. The prophet had spoken of Emmanuel. The Gospels would point to Jesus. He had described a child who would come. Jesus was born. He had described a servant who would be rejected, wounded, and silent before his accusers. Jesus was rejected. He was wounded. He was taken to the cross. And for Christians, Isaiah 53 became one of the clearest ancient descriptions of what that suffering meant. Isaiah never saw the cross with his own eyes, met Jesus, or heard the resurrection announced. Yet his words became part of the language through which the earliest Christians explained who Jesus was, the man who, according to ancient tradition, was killed because he refused to stop speaking, had left behind a message that would reach generations he could never have imagined. His enemies could control the final moments of his life. They could not control what came after. The king wanted the prophet gone. But the prophet's words outlived the king. The empire disappeared. The men who hunted Isaiah became part of ancient history. But Isaiah's voice remained, and it was still speaking when Jesus came. There is a strange irony at the center of Isaiah's story. The king who wanted his voice to disappear is remembered mainly for the things he did wrong. But the prophet he tried to silence is still being read thousands of years later. Isaiah's life did not end with the sound of a saw. It continued every time someone opened his book, and perhaps nowhere is that more powerful than in the way his story points toward Jesus. Isaiah had spoken about a servant who would suffer for others. He described rejection, wounds, silence before his accusers, and a burden carried on behalf of people who did not deserve it. Then, centuries later, the gospel story unfolded. Jesus was rejected. He was beaten. He was led to the cross. And when the earliest Christians tried to explain why the Messiah had to suffer, they repeatedly returned to Isaiah. But Isaiah's legacy is not simply that he predicted the future. His own life began to resemble the message he carried. He knew what it meant to be rejected. He knew what it meant to speak truth to people who did not want to hear it. And, according to the ancient tradition, he eventually experienced the kind of suffering he had spent years teaching others to understand. But there is something even more important here. Isaiah was not a man who never felt fear. The first time we meet him, he is terrified in the presence of God. He does not say, "I am strong enough for this." He says, "Woe is me," because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that fear will not make your decisions for you. He knew what it was like to watch a king make terrible choices, and still he kept returning to the message. That is why his story reaches beyond ancient Jerusalem. Most of us will never stand before a king with the power to execute us. But we all face choices between comfort and conviction. Sometimes telling the truth costs a friendship. Sometimes doing what is right costs approval. And sometimes refusing to compromise means standing alone. And sometimes the easiest thing in the world is simply to remain silent. Isaiah's story asks us what our faith looks like when silence becomes easier than obedience. Because his greatest legacy may not be the manner of his death, it may be the consistency of his life. The same man who stood before God's throne and said, "Here I am, send me," kept answering that call through decades of rejection, political turmoil, and danger. He did not know how his story would end. He only knew who had sent him. Isaiah never saw Jesus. He never stood beneath the cross. He never watched his own words become part of the story of the Messiah. But he spoke those words anyway. And generations later, the world was still listening. The king's soldiers may have silenced the man, but they never silenced the message. Isaiah's body, according to the ancient tradition, could be destroyed. His testimony could not. And perhaps that is why we are still telling his story. Not because he was fearless, but because he was faithful. And now the question is no longer about Isaiah. It is about us. When truth becomes uncomfortable, what do we choose? When silence would be easier, do we still speak? And when faithfulness costs us something, Do we still say the words Isaiah said at the beginning of his journey? "Here I am, send me"? Because sometimes the greatest test of faith is not whether we are willing to die for what we believe. It is whether we are willing to live for it when nobody is watching. So, if you were Isaiah, knowing what obedience might cost you, do you think you would have remained silent, or would you have kept speaking?